Hi everyone, and have a look at a couple of different techniques today. So we've got a nice mountain scene. Drawing out, again, quite simple. If you start with the horizon mountain line and making sure you get that in, then you can come down and get where the greenery starts, and you can do some little spikes as to where the trees are going to be. Then I want you to come from this end with the water and flow this through. I've actually come down to the bottom corner about here, so a little bit wider than the original photograph, and then I've gone up to about there on this side. So you've got between a third and a half. It's, I'd say, just nearly a third up there on the side of the paper, and I've gone portrait today. I've drawn in a few rocks, and then I want you to just concentrate on getting where the water's flowing down. So if you look very carefully this side, you'll see there's a couple of dips, and get that in, and then a couple of rocks in the water. So quite a light pencil drawing. Colours wise, I've mixed everything up before I've started. So I've got Gamboge yellow, Sap Green, these have all got a little bit of water in, raw Sienna, cobalt blue, a mixture of grey, which is cobalt blue and burnt sienna, a very dark green which I've made with intense blue or phthalo blue or Windsor blue and burnt sienna, and then a little bit of permanent rose. So we're going to come on first of all and get a sky in. So plenty of water with your wash brush. Come down to the mountain line. And then we've got quite a simple sky, so we're going to come in with cobalt blue. Missed a bit of water here. I'm just going to take a little bit of extra water in there. Missed a bit here as well. So you want plenty of cobalt blue in there, and then I'm going to touch into a little bit of rose, and I'm going to bring that towards the top. So I've got a bit of colour variation in there. I've not come all the way down to the mountain line, but there is water, and if I just lift this up slightly now, I can just make it run a little bit, and that will be enough. You can run it back as well. So I'm just fading that in. Run it sideways, you run it every way. Just 'cause you're in control when it's flat. Just missed a bit on the end there. Okay, so I'm just going to let that settle now and dry that off. Okay, so that's dried off really nicely now, and what I'm going to do, so I'm going to use my round number 10, and I'm going to come into these distant mountains with a bit of water. So I can sort of head towards the green area, where it's darker grey I can come in as well. Then I'm going to pop in some raw sienna. So just pop that in where you can see, it's mainly on this one, that yellowy tone. a little bit in there. And then I'm going to come into my grey. And just start to drop that in. I just want you to really think about getting some tonal bits in here to start with. Then I'll explain what I'm going to do and we can build on that after. If we need to, we're going to use a credit card technique, which you scrape the paper with. It works quite nicely. You just don't want it, you've got to get the balance of it not being too wet and not being too dry. Okay, so here's my little bit of credit card. I am just going to add a tiny bit of water just into this one here. And you can use the corner, so this is just a chopped up bit of a Sainsbury's loyalty card, and you can use the flat edge. So to use the flat edge, you get it and you scrape, and you can follow the line of the hillside or mountain. So I'm just going to do plenty of this. If you do it and nothing really happens, it just flows back, it's too wet. Obviously if you do it and nothing happens and it's really dry, you'll have that same effect. It'll just not do anything. So you can come in and create craggy areas using the corner in indenting like we would do with anything a bit harder, so you can get these nice craggy effects. You're just thinking artistic impression. It doesn't have to be exact. You just want to start to, you can see here where I've scraped, it's worked really well. You want to do a bit of scraping, then you're going to add a little bit more. So it's just pulling that colour away off the paper. Hopefully you've seen this. It's a really interesting effect. The beauty of mountains is they can be quite craggy, and we're going to use this on the stones as well. So now at this stage I've got a round number 6. It's still a bit damp, and that works to your advantage. You can come in and darken some areas. You can use whichever brush you want really at this stage. So if you wanted something a bit finer, you could use something finer. You can add little bits more water. In a way you can break the rules a little bit with cragginess. An odd watermark does work quite nicely. So where I've got all of this start, which is actually very distant trees, but I need to start to build that in, I can do that now with a little bit of softness with the grey. So I'm just adding tiny little bits. You could add a little bit of blue in places if you want. It's always good to have a little bit of the sky colour in. fact, I shall just add a tiny bit of blue in places. So I'm just picking up a little bit of blue. Get a little bit. It will give a coolness and a bit more shadow. The raw sienna is not that strong, so it'll work quite nicely. You shouldn't make a green. Just with a bit of damp water, I'm just going to soften this in. Just there. So I don't want that to be too strong. You could come back in and scrape a little bit more if you wanted. So you can just build up. That's again a little bit of water just to help that spread a little bit. I'm just looking to pull out a few darker areas. It tends to help them stand out a little bit more on the skyline. I've got my round number 10. I've just loaded it with water and I'm just going to come along this bottom edge now. What I want is to just soften some of this in so it's not so harsh. So we're going to have to come over with greens later, dark greens, so that's just going to help break that in a little bit. Okay, so I'm going to dry that off. Okay, so that's all dry. I'm just going to come along the water's edge where all these rocks are. Just start to get some colour in for those. You can come higher than the rocks. I'm going to dab in with some raw sienna. And then I'm going to just pick up a touch of rose. Don't want it to be too strong, but there's a bit of warmth in places. So I'm just going to pop a bit of that in. And then rinse my brush and dry off, and then I'm going to come in with some bits of grey. So where it's very distant, I'm just going to leave it as is, but where it's closer, I'm going to do some more scraping with the credit card. So into these bits that are distant, you can use the corner of the credit card to indent, and that will give a little bit of an effect. This is why it's quite good to have a chopped up little bit of credit card or loyalty card, because it does work quite nicely as a smaller tool. It's not very often that you need to do full sections. Right, so that's still a little bit wet. So whilst that's still a bit wet, I'm going to come into these rocks within the water. Just keep an eye on it. You can of course wait and just come back to them. Right, so round number 6, just going to dab a little bit of the raw sienna into those, and then come in with quite a lot of the grey. These ones are going to look a little bit strange to start with, but when I come to do the water you'll see what I'm going to do with them. So this is more the exposed rocks that you can see. see if I can move any of this now. Yep. So I just want you again to create that sort of rock effect scraping. It's trickier because it's a smaller area, but there's lots of sort of craggy indent bits you can pop in as well. You can use, if you cut a little circular bit on the edge, you can use that to scrape as well. That's quite good for littler areas. But you just want to get that textured effect. And then I'm just going to grab the grey, just come in and help to define where the edges are on some of these. And in fact, if I come in and I want to put that darker bit of grey in there where this is, and I can just indent at the same time, then I'll get that edge appearing around that rock. It's quite big rock. As with all these things, it's always practice. I know I make some of this look very easy, but the more you practice, the better you'll get at this. So I'm just looking for those darker areas just to help to define. This rock effect. You can do a little bit of scraping onto these rocks in the water. It's not essential. If you want them to look a little bit more rock-like, then it does help, but it's not essential. I'm going to come down to these ones at the front now. So a little bit of water. Raw sienna. By this point you should be getting more practice and you know when to have a go. Pick up a little bit of rose. Then lots of grey. I'm going to have to wait a second for that one just to dry a little bit. Just try and see if I can scrape into that a little bit more now. It's just waiting for the right timing. Okay, so I've just expanded the camera out so you can see this bit in the scraping that I'm going to do down here now. So I'm just going to start to scrape in. Using the flat of the credit card. And then I can do any indents with the corner. So if it's moving back, just keep doing it until it stays how you want it. And then I can come in with a little bit more grey. Build any of these areas up. So I lost the edge a little bit there when I scraped, but I can just make a new edge. I'd really like to get a bit of light on this one, it just keeps running back still. That's it. Okay, so I'm going to dry that off. That's all nice and dry now. So we're going to come into this background area. So I'm going to bring the water up to where I blurred the lines, and then down just slightly over this rocky bit. So we're covering the whole of this section, big section, but we're just going to move steadily through. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is pick up a bit of grey and just start to connect this section and the previous section. So if I come in straight away with the dark green, it's going to be too much. So we need to create that bit of a blend as we bring it forward. Plus we want these trees to be a little bit softer. Brush and rinse. I'm going to come into it's a bit darker in a second. Change your plan. We'll get a bit of raw sienna. Okay, it's mixed slightly with the green, but that's fine, just in this section. And then we're going to take a little bit of Gamboge yellow into this front section. So we're starting with the duller yellow towards the background, which is the raw sienna, and then brightening up with the other one. So come back in again to that green. So I want it to be dark, but I don't want it to be that dark until we come on with the trees. So this is now sort of blending through. So we're thinking very distant trees, not the defined trees at this stage. I just want to create this nice blend. So this is really coming on to where the raw sienna is. What's quite good is it will shoot and it will start to look a little bit like trees, which will help with the next stage anyway. Brush a bit of a rinse. Then I'm going to come into the Sap Green. And I'm sort of arching over. We're going to do a little bit of sponging into this later. So at this stage we just want to create the background colour. You want it to be bright. What you can see now is a definite cut off. You've got darker, brighter. What I would do just to help to connect them is take a little bit of the green, the darker green, in places. So if you squint at the photograph, you'll see that there's areas that are a little bit darker where there's shadow. We're just going to blend a few of those through, and it just starts to connect it all together. Now I just want you to look at your rocks, because we've blended over the rocks, which is what we've wanted to do. I'm using a tiny bit of dry kitchen towel just so that I don't lose the edge of the ones that I want to be a bit higher. So I'm just dabbing in places. You can use a little bit more of that dark green just to define in places if you want as well. Right, I'm going to swap down. So that was all round number 10. I'm going to swap down to round number 6 now. And I want to get these darker trees in. The trick is to get it at the right consistency. And you're only going to put a few in, so you're not going to go mad. I'm going to start with this really tall one here. So I've got my dark green. The brush is nearly dry and I'm just picking up the colour. Not too much, and just placing it on. So you want an impression of these fir trees. You see how I'm using my brush vertically, and I'm starting from the top of the tree and letting go at the bottom, so the well of paint comes out at the bottom. You can add and dab a little bit more at the bottom. You can come over some once you've got to a point that they're settling in okay. So these are coming in to this lighter area. So I'm just drawing in a few lines so I know where they are, or painting in a few lines. So you're going for an impression of. I say this a lot, but it doesn't have to be exact. It's your interpretation. And you can see you can just tweak and fiddle once you get to a point that you're nearly there. I'm watching all the time, I'm watching everything, making sure that it's not running too much in places. If I want it darker, I've got to let it dry just that little bit longer and then come back in. Okay, I'm quite happy with that. I'm going to dry that off. Okay, so I've dried that one off. I'm going to come into this bottom section here now. Just to start to get some base of colour on before we come on and do some sponging. And I'm coming in with some Gambo's yellow. You can take a little bit of the raw sienna just towards this back section so it's not as bright. Helps to give a sense of distance. And then in with some sap green. So what I'm doing is blending through so I don't end up with strokes. The way that the grass is working, it's better for us to have like little arches of colour than strokes of colour. And then down here we've got the bank coming down. Then I'm going to pick up some of the darker green again. And just bring some of that in so it's a bit darker towards this end. So we can build that up. Now I'm just looking where the sweeps of dark are. And again, it's like little arches, little arcs, where the grass is blowing around. So I'm just going to pop some of that on. And then I can dry that off. Okay, so that's dried off really nicely. And what I want to do now is to soften in some of these edges on the rocks before I come in with doing the water. So I have got here, it's an oil painting brush. I think it was a filbert. I've not used it for oil painting. It's fairly soft as an oil painting brush would go. I use it for watercolour and I use it for softening in. So you can see I've just popped some water on. What I'm going to do now is come round the edge of this rock. So I'm just scrubbing round the edge. And that's going to be lifting some of the colour. I've got nice clean water, clean kitchen towel, and it's just going to give that effect that water's flowing over the edge of these rocks. So it's lifting it a little bit. fading it out. And that in effect is going to ground the rock as well. So that one definitely needs it round there. So you might need to do it a couple of times, but you'll get that softening in effect. Once you've done that, you need to dry it really well, and then we'll come back and do the water. Okay, so I've dried that really well. I've got two brushes, my round number 6, which I'm going to apply the paint with, and my round number 10 that is wet. I've got nice clean water, and I've got plenty of the cobalt blue, plus you might need a little bit of grey and a little bit of raw sienna in places. So the trick is to start one side and work your way down. So I am right-handed, so it's easier to start here. So what I'm going to do with a loaded brush is start to come in and create the flow of the water. So I know that the water's flowing down. I know that there's quite a lot of white within the water. So a wet in wet technique isn't really going to work, but this technique of flowing works really nicely. So what I'm doing is just flowing down, odd little bits, odd little dabs. So I'm just looking at where the colour is really in the water. At this stage now I'm just going to pick up a little bit of grey, just run it in where I can see it looks a little bit dark, so it might be going over a rock. There's a little bit within there. So this is, I'm running this into wet, a little bit there. Right, then with my loaded brush I can soften in. By softening in, I mean I'm touching areas where the paint's wet. I'm taking water in, and that's just going to help with the flow. So a good example of this now is if I just pull from here. So I've got a wet brush and I'm pulling from that painted edge. It's very, very subtle. And you see where I've pulled the water? So I can just pull from this painted edge, and then I start to create that flow. Come over some of these rocks, round other rocks. I'll leave us closer so you can see for this next section now. It's quite subtle because it's quite light. So if I come in now, again, cobalt blue round number 10. Coming round these rocks, sort of flowing this way. There's a little bit of rock there. Bubbling down, take a little bit under here, a few dabs here and there. There's quite a lot flowing down here. A bit there. Bit of grey. Dropping in whilst it's still damp. A little bit along that bottom edge. A little bit there. There's some sort of rock in there, so we're going to pop a bit in there. Wet brush, just touching in places. So this is just helping to soften in some edges, and again I can pull a little bit this way, so I'm following the direction of the water all the time. It's quite a big sweep. Okay, so we've done this next section. We're going to come in and start same process on this section. So section by section, following the flow of the water. If you vary the pressure of your brush, that creates some nice effects as well. You can add bits of colour in. This is a section where you could add a little bit of the raw sienna, a bit of the rose in if you wanted. Not essential. Everybody has a different interpretation. The key is to just really make sure that you've loaded your brush so that colour doesn't dry before you pop the water on. So you can see that I'm following the flow where the water's going, coming round. Remember, you can't add the white after, so don't add too much. You can't take it away. Have a little bit of grey in these bits. They're coming over some rocks. And I'm going to just pop a bit of the rose in, just where I can see, and a little bit of the raw sienna, just where I can see it's going over rocks. Loaded brush with water, and I'm just dabbing in places and bringing this through as if it's flowing through. As you get to this section, because it's flowing, it makes it a lot easier rather than the bubbly section. You can just flow through. The trick is to not pick up too much of the paint, let the paint move into the water. You just want to be looking and thinking at, do you want a soft edge or a hard edge at points? So we definitely want a soft edge around here where it's flowing. An odd watermark in water works brilliantly, so if you add a bit too much water and it starts to watermark, you don't need to worry at all. That's a good effect in water. In fact, sometimes I make it happen. Have a look at this section, because this looks a little bit hard here. So I'm just going to bring a little bit of water through there. In fact, I might take a little bit too much water in, just so it splays out. It'll make it watermark and give a really nice effect. You can always step back and have a look. It's working really nicely. I'm going to watermark it a little bit there. So this is just adding more water as it's drying, and it'll watermark. Okay, so I'll dry that off now. Okay, so I've now got my natural sponge, and the sponge I'm using has got lots and lots of little bobbly bits. It works really nicely. So I've wet it, I've wrung it out well, and I've dabbed it on some kitchen towel. A flat palette always works better for picking up the colour. So what I've done is I've picked up some of the Sap Green mixed, and then I'm just going to come in to this section here and just create a little bit of texture. So I'm dabbing, lifting up, twisting, so that I'm getting different texture and different marks every single time. If you try to do it with the same angle, you'll end up with a pattern. So it needs to be ensured that it's random. This is just going to give you some nice little bits of texture. I've dabbed off a couple of times, so I don't want it to be too wet over this side. You can also take in a tiny little bit of the dark green. Just be careful how much you're taking in. You don't need a huge amount. Stick to the areas where you've got that natural shadow. I've only picked up a tiny little bit on the edge of the sponge here. I don't want this area to be too dark. A little bit of burnt sienna if you wanted some natural shadow over that side would work quite nicely as well. Okay, I'm going to come on to this side. What I'm going to do is I'm going to twist around like this. Just checking you can still see. Now I want to get like a grass effect now. This takes a bit of practice again. But you're just going to stroke through nice and lightly. So I've got the colour on. It's easier to stroke downwards. So move your paper so that you can create these different angles. And you're going to concentrate on doing this in the front foreground section. You're going to fade it out towards the background. You don't see every individual bit of grass in the background. It's going to help give you a sense of distance. You can bring it over the rocks, you can bring it over the water. With sponging, you always use more paint than you think. So you make sure you've got plenty of paint mixed up. You could use a brush to do this, but it would take a long time and it wouldn't look as natural. You can use like an oil painting brush and come on and get these similar strokes again, but it doesn't quite look as natural as this. This tends to work much better, this process. So I'm doing some little bits towards here to give an indication, but I'm going to fade it out. I'm just going to dry that off and then I'll come in with another layer. Okay, so I've got 2 layers of sap green and now I'm coming on with a little bit of the dark green. I want you to be really careful when you're doing this that you don't go too heavy too soon. In fact, you could water down some of the colour if you're a little bit nervous. Just build it up. You need some of this dark to come through so you get that depth and that movement that we see in the photograph. So we're just going to bring some of that into the shadow. And just when you come towards the edges, you can just bring it slightly over your rocks. It helps to sort of blur that line slightly over the water. The more layers of this you do, the more depth you'll get at the front. Okay, I'm going to dry that off and then we'll do one more layer. Okay, so that's nice and dry now. So I'm picking up some of the darker green again. A little bit more of the darker green, a bit thicker this time. And I'm going to be quite brave, especially towards this front section. You can see as soon as I come on with this, it's just giving it that additional depth and movement. It's going to work really nicely. Keep it to this bottom quarter of the page, this real dark. You've got the shadow in above, but I think that's working really nicely. So I've turned this back round now. You'll be able to see the full effect. Hope you've enjoyed it. See you next week.